They said Robert Thornton died peacefully in his bed. But no one knew that inside his locked desk was a will so dangerous it would destroy families, reputations, and rewrite the fate of a woman who was never meant to inherit anything. In the summer of 1854, in one of the wealthiest towns along the Mississippi River, a man named Robert Thornton died quietly in his sleep. No screams, no struggle, no final confession, just silence. Inside a mansion so large, most people only saw it from behind iron gates. To the outside world, Robert Thornton was a perfect Southern gentleman, a respected plantation owner, a man whose dinners were attended by judges, bankers, and politicians, a man whose handshake could decide the future of an entire family. But behind the heavy curtains of his estate, behind the locked doors and whispered conversations, there was something no one talked about, something that, once revealed, would tear Natchez apart. Because Robert Thornton did not leave behind just land, just money, just property. He left behind a decision that would make powerful people desperate, humiliate a proud wife, and place a dangerous spotlight on a woman society had never allowed to matter. And it all began with a sealed envelope. Robert's death spread through town before sunrise. By midday, black mourning cloth covered the gates of his mansion. Church bells rang slow and heavy. Business stopped. Men removed their hats when they passed his property, not because they loved him, but because they feared losing what his influence had protected. Inside the mansion, his wife, Margaret Thornton, sat upright in a velvet chair, her face dry, her posture stiff, her hands gripping a handkerchief she had not yet used. In Natchez, women were expected to cry, to collapse into grief, but Margaret did neither, because Margaret did not fear loneliness. She feared something else. She feared the will. Across the room stood James Whitfield, a respected attorney and Robert's own brother-in-law, the man trusted with the most important document of Robert Thornton's entire life. The will had been written years earlier, sealed with wax, and locked inside a private desk that only Robert could open. Until now, Whitfield had not read it. No one had. And in that silence, fear grew, because powerful men do not protect secrets unless those secrets can destroy them. By evening, family members gathered in the drawing room, the brother, the cousins, business partners pretending to be mourners, and standing quietly near the back of the room, almost unnoticed, was a young enslaved woman named Sarah. She had been brought into the house years earlier, officially listed as household property. She spoke when spoken to, she looked down when addressed. She obeyed every rule that kept her invisible. No one paid attention to her presence. No one thought they needed to. Not yet. When Attorney Whitfield finally stood, the room went still. He cleared his throat, unfolded the document, and began reading in a voice trained for courtrooms. At first, everything sounded normal. Property divisions, business transfers, money set aside for investments. Nods of approval moved through the room. Margaret relaxed slightly, as if the future was already secure. Then, Whitfield paused, not for a dramatic effect, but because his eyes had stopped moving. He read the next line again, slowly, carefully, as if hoping he had misunderstood it. Then he looked up, and in that moment, everyone knew something had gone very wrong. Whitfield spoke again, and the words that followed would become the most whispered sentence. In Natchez for decades, a significant portion of Robert Thornton's estate was not left to his wife, not to his brother, not to any blood relative. It was left to Sarah. The room did not react at first, not because they were calm, but because their minds could not process what they had just heard. Then voices erupted, shouts, denials, accusations of fraud. Margaret stood up so fast her chair fell backward. Her face, now pale and shaking, finally showed emotion, not grief, rage, because in the South of 1854, This was not just scandal. This was betrayal. This was social suicide. This was an unforgivable violation of every unspoken rule that protected power. And suddenly, every eye in the room turned toward the woman who had been invisible seconds earlier. Sarah stood frozen. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became shallow, because she did not know yet that this inheritance could ruin her life far faster than it could save it. Margaret's voice broke the silence, not with tears, but with something colder. She demanded the will be challenged. She accused Whitfield of manipulation. She accused Sarah of seduction, because in her world there was only one explanation. For a man choosing a slave over his wife, it had to be shame. It had to be sin. It had to be something that could be punished, and punishment in that era, did not require proof. It required anger and influence. That night, while the mansion remained full of guests, Sarah was quietly removed from the house, not for her safety, but because no one wanted to see her. She was taken back to the servants' quarters, where whispers followed her through every hallway. Some said she had cast a spell, others said she had threatened Robert, but the most dangerous rumor was that Robert had loved her. And in the antebellum South, that kind of love could get people killed. Meanwhile, Margaret began planning, not mourning, not resting, but preparing for war, because she knew something that no one else wanted to admit. Even if the court allowed the will, society would never accept it. And she intended to use that. She would challenge the document, challenge Sarah's right to own property, challenge Robert's sanity. And if that failed, she would make sure Sarah never enjoyed a single dollar of that inheritance. But what Margaret did not know was that Robert Thornton's decision had not been impulsive. It had been deliberate, planned, protected, and backed by evidence that could destroy far more than one marriage. Because the truth behind why Robert chose Sarah was darker, deeper, and more dangerous than anyone in that room was ready to face. And once the courts became involved, there would be no turning back. The courtroom in Natchez had seen fights over land, over money, over reputations, but it had never seen a case like this. On one side of the room sat Margaret Thornton, dressed in black silk, her face calm, her eyes sharp and calculating. On the other side sat Sarah, not dressed in mourning, not dressed in power, just a simple cotton dress, hands folded in her lap, trying not to meet anyone's stare. Between them stood the will, and in the antebellum South, paper could be more dangerous than a weapon. The judge entered, the room stood, and when everyone sat again, no one spoke, because everyone knew whatever happened in this room would not stay in this room. It would spread through plantations, churches, and dining tables, turning neighbors into enemies and whispers into threats. Attorney Whitfield rose first. He spoke calmly, but his voice carried a warning. He reminded the court that Robert Thornton was known for his sharp mind, his careful decisions, and his detailed records. This was not a man who made mistakes with money, and certainly not a man who changed his will without reason. Then Margaret's attorney stood, and he attacked not the document, but the woman. He spoke of influence, of improper behavior, of moral corruption. He suggested that Sarah had manipulated Robert, that she had used intimacy to gain access to wealth, because in that era, a woman like Sarah was not allowed to be loyal, or honest, or deserving. She was allowed to be accused. Sarah did not speak. She was not permitted to. Her past, her feelings, her reality, none of it mattered. What mattered was whether powerful people felt threatened, and they did. Then something unexpected happened. Whitfield presented letters, private correspondence written by Robert himself, letters describing his intentions, his plans, his reasons. The room leaned forward, even Margaret's confidence faltered. Because these letters did not speak of weakness. They spoke of responsibility, of guilt, of something Robert felt he needed to make right. And suddenly, this was no longer just about inheritance. It was about history and mistakes that could not be erased. Margaret's attorney objected. He claimed the letters were emotional, not legal proof. He demanded medical records, evidence of Robert's mental state. He argued that grief, illness, or manipulation could explain everything. And then he made his most dangerous move. He requested that Sarah be examined by the court, not medically, but socially, her behavior, her character, her associations, because if they could prove she was improper, they could argue she was undeserving of protection under law. And that kind of examination was designed to break people. After court adjourned for the day, Sarah did not return to the servants' quarters. Whitfield insisted she be placed under protection, but protection in that time did not mean safety. It meant isolation. She was moved to a small boarding house on the edge of town, far from the plantation, far from familiar faces. That night, someone threw a stone through her window. No note, no message, just a warning. Margaret, meanwhile, was not waiting for court decisions. She was visiting families, calling in favors, reminding people of what they owed her husband's name. She spoke carefully, never directly attacking Sarah, but always planting doubt. And doubt, in the right social circles, could destroy someone faster than proof. The second court session brought new tension. Witnesses were called, house servants, business partners, neighbors, people who had seen Robert and Sarah together. Some spoke of kindness, others hinted at secrecy, but none could explain why Robert would sacrifice his wife's future for a woman society did not even consider fully human. And that question hung over the room like a storm cloud. Then Margaret testified, and she did not cry. She did not scream. She spoke slowly, with controlled pain. She spoke of betrayal, of discovering emotional distance in her marriage, of humiliation she had suffered in silence. And she framed herself not as an angry woman, but as a loyal wife who had been publicly dishonored. The courtroom sympathized, because people understand wounded pride more than complicated truth. When Sarah was finally allowed to speak, her voice was barely steady. She denied manipulation, denied seduction, denied any plan to gain wealth. But she did not deny something else. She did not deny that Robert had protected her, helped her, treated her differently. And in that single admission, the room reacted, because protection itself was considered proof of wrongdoing. The judge postponed the ruling. More investigation was ordered. More witnesses would be summoned. And the case that should have ended in weeks was now clearly going to stretch into years. Years of legal battles, years of public judgment. Years where Sarah would be known not as a person, but as a scandal. That evening, Whitfield met with Sarah privately, and for the first time, he told her the truth. Robert had not just left her money. He had left documents, property deeds, statements that could expose business practices, family arrangements, and actions that, if revealed, would bring down several respected men in Natchez. Robert had not simply chosen her, he had protected her, with evidence, and that meant, as long as this case continued, she was in danger. Because people can forgive betrayal, they cannot forgive exposure. By the third month of the court battle, Natchez was no longer whispering, it was watching Sarah walk to hearings under guard, watching Margaret arrive in polished carriages, watching neighbors take sides, not based on truth, but on comfort, because believing the wealthy widow was easier than believing a system had failed. But inside Attorney Whitfield's office, a different story was slowly unfolding, a story Robert Thornton had buried carefully, knowing that once revealed, it could never be undone. Whitfield unlock. A wooden cabinet that had not been opened since Robert's death. Inside were journals, receipts, and letters that were never mailed. Not love letters, not romantic poetry, but records, cold, detailed, undeniable. Robert had been documenting something for years, something involving plantation finances, and something involving Sarah's mother. Years earlier, before Sarah had even been brought into the main house. Her mother worked in the cotton fields. She became sick, weak, unable to meet daily quotas. Instead of sending her for treatment, the overseer forced her to continue working. She collapsed and died 2 days later. Her death was never recorded as a workplace failure. It was listed as natural causes. But Robert knew the truth, and he had proof. The documents showed that Sarah's mother had been forced to work to protect profit margins during a season of falling cotton prices. If that information became public, several plantation owners could be accused of criminal negligence, and Robert's own business partners were directly involved, including men who now sat behind Margaret in court, men who smiled politely, while praying the truth stayed buried. Robert had tried to intervene quietly. He paid for medical care for other workers. He changed field assignments. He improved living conditions. But those changes made him enemies, because compassion costs money, and in plantation economics, profit came before survival. When Sarah grew older, Robert moved her into the main house, officially as a domestic servant, unofficially as someone he wanted to protect, not because of romance, not because of guilt alone, but because she was the only living witness to what had happened in those fields. And if anything happened to her, so did the truth. The inheritance was not kindness. It was security. It was protection built into law, because once she owned property, once she had legal status as an heir, she could not be quietly erased. Whitfield understood now. Robert had not challenged society. He had challenged silence, and silence was what powerful men relied on. But outside the courtroom, danger was growing. One evening, as Sarah returned to the boarding house, 2 men followed her down a side street. They did not speak. They did not touch her. They simply walked close enough that she could smell tobacco on their coats, close enough to understand the message. "You are being watched." When Whitfield reported the incident, the sheriff promised investigation, but no arrests were made, because no one wanted to admit that respected citizens might be involved in intimidation. Meanwhile, Margaret's strategy shifted. She no longer attacked Sarah directly. She attacked Robert's memory. She began presenting evidence of emotional instability, sleepless nights, mood changes, conflicted business decisions. She claimed her husband had become obsessed with righting past wrongs, and she framed that obsession as proof of mental decline, because if Robert was unstable, the will could be declared invalid, and Sarah would be left with nothing. Then came the witness no one expected, a former overseer, a man who had worked on multiple plantations. He testified that Robert had questioned labor practices, that he had argued with business partners, that he had threatened to expose unsafe working conditions, and that after those arguments, his business relationships suffered. This was not proof of madness. It was proof of conflict, and conflict meant motive. The courtroom shifted. Suddenly, the story was no longer about betrayal. It was about consequences. That night, Whitfield warned Sarah that the case was becoming dangerous, not legally, physically, because if the documents were entered into evidence, they would damage powerful families. And powerful families do not wait for verdicts. They prevent them. Whitfield considered turning the papers over to the press, but newspapers in that era were not neutral. Most were owned by men connected to plantation interests. Publishing the truth could put Sarah in even greater danger. So he waited, and waiting almost cost her life. Just before dawn, the boarding house caught fire, not enough to destroy it, just enough to send smoke through the halls, enough to make sure everyone knew. This was not an accident. Sarah escaped through a back window. Her hands burned, her lungs filled with smoke, but she survived, and now there was no doubt. This case was no longer about money. It was about survival. When court resumed, security was increased, but fear had already spread. Witnesses began refusing to testify. Documents went missing. Statements changed. And Margaret, watching carefully, understood something before anyone else did. The inheritance was not the problem. The truth was, and if the truth came out, she would not be the only one ruined. That realization changed her completely, because now, she was not just defending her wealth, she was protecting an entire social order. And the deeper the court looked, the more it became clear. Robert Thornton's will was not the beginning of this story. It was the final move. In a much longer, Margaret Thornton had spent her entire life learning one skill, not kindness, not patience, but influence. She knew how to read rooms, how to shape opinions, how to make powerful men feel like decisions were their own. And now, as her husband's reputation was being questioned, and her fortune stood on the edge of collapse, she used every lesson she had ever learned. Her first move was silence. She stopped attacking Sarah publicly. She stopped speaking to the press. She allowed sympathy to grow around her, because silence, when used correctly, can look like dignity, and dignity attracts allies. Her second move was private. She invited judges' wives to tea. She sent handwritten letters to church leaders. She reminded bankers of favors Robert had once provided. Not threatening, just remembering. And in small towns, memory is power. Slowly, the tone of the trial began to shift. Judges questioned evidence more carefully. Objections were sustained more frequently. Delays increased. And delay was exactly what Margaret needed, because fear grows faster than truth. Meanwhile, Sarah's protection became stricter. She was moved again, this time to a guarded property owned by Whitfield's family. But isolation does not protect the mind, it weakens it. She stopped sleeping. She jumped at every sound, and the stress of public scrutiny began to break her physically. But she did not withdraw the claim, because she knew what would happen if she gave up. Then came Margaret's boldest strategy. She introduced a new accusation, not against Sarah, but against Whitfield. She suggested that the attorney had manipulated the will, that he had influenced Robert, that he was using Sarah as a shield to hide his own ambition. It was brilliant, because now the court had to consider whether the very man presenting evidence was also benefiting from it. Suddenly, Whitfield was no longer just a lawyer, he was a suspect, and his credibility mattered more than any document he presented. At the same time, business partners of Robert Thornton began arriving in court, men who had never testified before, men who now claimed Robert had been unstable, that he had spoken about guilt, about divine punishment, about needing to correct his soul. They framed the will not as justice, but as emotional confession, and emotional decisions, they argued, should not control legal outcomes. The court ordered psychological testimony. Doctors who had never treated Robert were asked to analyze letters and journals. They spoke of obsessive behavior, of moral fixation, of psychological strain, all without ever mentioning the economic motives behind that stress. Sarah watched this happen without understanding half of the language being used, legal phrases, medical terms, strategies built in rooms she was never allowed to enter, and yet her life depended on them. One night, Whitfield confessed something to her. He told her that even if they won the case, they might lose something else, because once evidence of plantation abuses became public, the court might protect powerful families by sacrificing her claim, not because she was wrong, but because she was convenient. That was the moment Sarah understood something brutal. This system did not exist to protect truth. It existed to protect stability, and stability was built on silence. Margaret sensed this shift. She saw fear working in her favor, and so she made her final move. She offered a settlement, quietly, through intermediaries. Money, not the full inheritance, but enough to disappear, enough to leave town, enough to stop talking. And the message was clear: take the money or take the consequences. Whitfield advised Sarah to refuse, because accepting would confirm guilt in public opinion. But Sarah hesitated, because fear does not care about reputation. Fear only cares about survival. As she struggled with the decision, something unexpected happened. A former field worker came forward, a man who had been silent for years. He claimed he had helped carry Sarah's mother from the fields the day she collapsed. He claimed he had heard overseers argue about pushing workers too hard, and he was willing to testify, but only if he could be protected. This was the turning point, because his testimony could confirm everything in Robert's documents. And if that happened, the case would no longer be about inheritance. It would become a criminal investigation into plantation operations, something the town had never allowed. Margaret learned about the witness within days, and for the first time, her calm cracked. Because now, she was no longer fighting for wealth. She was fighting for survival, for families, for reputations, for an entire economy built on denial. And when powerful systems feel threatened, they do not negotiate, they eliminate. The man's name was Elijah Brooks. He had worked cotton fields since he was 12 years old. He had buried friends, watched families disappear, and learned early that silence kept you alive. So when he walked into Whitfield's office asking to testify, everyone understood what that meant. He was risking everything. Elijah told his story carefully, how Sarah's mother had collapsed after working double shifts, how overseers ignored her cries, how Robert Thornton had argued with managers afterward. He remembered Robert offering medical help. He remembered the overseer refusing, because lost labor meant lost profit, and profit ruled every decision. Whitfield arranged for Elijah to be placed under guard, not government protection. Just men loyal to the law, but loyalty is fragile. When fear enters the room, 2 nights before Elijah was scheduled to testify, his guard did not arrive for their shift. By morning, Elijah was gone. No signs of struggle, no broken doors, just an empty bed, and a town that suddenly did not want to ask questions. The courtroom reacted in controlled silence. Margaret's attorneys expressed polite concern, but no one demanded investigation, because investigation meant exposure, and exposure threatened too many people. Sarah realized something in that moment. She was not protected by law, she was protected by inconvenience, and once she became inconvenient, she could disappear too. Whitfield urged her to leave town just for a few days. But she refused, because running would confirm what everyone wanted to believe, that she had something to hide. Then came the betrayal. One of Whitfield's own assistants began secretly sharing legal strategies with Margaret's attorneys. Bribes were never proven, but information was leaking, and every leak weakened their position. The judge postponed hearings again, claiming lack of witnesses, lack of evidence, lack of clarity. But the truth was simpler. The court was waiting to see who would break first. Margaret visited Sarah for the first time, not publicly, not dramatically. She came alone. She spoke softly. She did not threaten. She spoke about exhaustion, about wanting peace, about how both of them had lost Robert in different ways. And then she repeated the offer: money, transportation, a fresh start in another state. No more hearings, no more danger. For the first time, Sarah considered it, not because she wanted wealth, but because she wanted to live. That night, Whitfield told her something he had not shared before. If she left, the documents Robert left behind would likely be sealed. The abuses would never be addressed. The men responsible would continue operating, and nothing would change. Sarah faced an impossible choice: survive or tell the truth. She chose the truth. The next court session became chaos. Whitfield presented new evidence, financial records, internal communications, proof that labor practices were intentionally concealed. Margaret's attorneys objected violently. Judges argued, Spectators shouted, and for the first time, the trial threatened to turn into criminal prosecution. That evening, Whitfield received an anonymous letter. One sent, "In say, stop now or she's next." He moved Sarah to an undisclosed location, but secrecy did not last long. Someone always talks. 2 days later, a carriage carrying Sarah was attacked outside town. The driver was beaten. The horses were cut loose. Sarah escaped into the woods and hid until dawn. But now, everyone knew, someone was trying to remove her permanently. Public opinion began to shift because intimidation was now impossible to hide. And when violence becomes visible, even loyal systems begin to crack. The governor ordered limited investigation, not into plantation practices, but into the attacks, and that created a new problem, because now, law enforcement was involved, and law enforcement leaves records. Margaret realized the situation was spiraling beyond control, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. For months, people in Natchez believed the inheritance was about romance, that Robert Thornton had broken social rules for emotional reasons, that scandal was born from passion. But that story was convenient because it was simple, and simple stories protect complex crimes. When investigators finally reviewed Robert's private journals, they found something far more dangerous than love. They found accounting, detailed records of cotton shipments, labor quotas, medical costs that were never paid, and profits that rose when working conditions worsened. Robert had documented how much suffering, had increased production, not to celebrate it, but to expose it. He had been preparing testimony, not just for court, but for federal authorities, because new labor regulations were being discussed at the time, and Robert had intended to cooperate, which meant entire plan. Plantation networks could face investigation. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, Robert's will looked less like generosity and more like strategy. He had placed his evidence in the hands of someone society would never expect, someone people would dismiss, someone who would never be suspected of holding documents powerful enough to destroy reputations. Sarah was not just an heir, she was a shield. When this became known, the tone of the courtroom changed overnight. Judges who once delayed now rushed proceedings. Attorneys who once argued technicalities now avoided direct questions, because now every delay looked like obstruction. Margaret's legal team tried to regain control. They argued Robert had exaggerated conditions, that market stress had forced difficult decisions, that moral regret did not equal legal wrongdoing, and they repeated the same defense again and again. No law was broken, only feelings were hurt. But then came the letter, a sealed envelope, postmarked weeks before Robert's death, addressed to a federal labor office in Washington, never sent, because Robert had died before mailing it, and inside were copies of his records, names, dates, and signatures of business partners. Men who were now sitting in the courtroom, men who now looked very uncomfortable. Suddenly, Margaret was no longer the most powerful person in the room. She was surrounded by men who were terrified of prison, and terrified. People are unpredictable. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some angry, some curious, some demanding justice. For the first time, this case became more than gossip. It became political. Whitfield warned Sarah that this attention could help or destroy her, because now she was not just a claimant. She was a living archive. And if she testified about what she knew, people would not be able to pretend anymore. But testifying meant risk, real risk, because witnesses had already disappeared, and now the stakes were even higher. Then came the twist no one expected. Medical testimony revealed that Robert had not died peacefully. Subtle signs of poisoning were discovered, nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, but consistent with slow-acting compounds, enough to weaken the body, enough to appear natural, enough to silence a man before he could send letters that would ruin lives. The courtroom exploded, because now This was no longer inheritance court. This was homicide investigation. Margaret denied any involvement. So did the business partners. Everyone denied everything. But denial could not erase opportunity, and many people had motive. Suddenly, the will made sense. Robert had known he was dying, and he had planned for what came after. He had placed the truth where no one would expect it, and he had chosen Sarah not out of romance, but out of necessity. Sarah understood now. She had not inherited wealth. She had inherited danger. Protection was increased. Federal investigators arrived, and Natchez felt different, quiet, careful, because once federal eyes arrive, local influence weakens. Margaret, watching power slip away, made one final calculation. If she could not win legally, she would survive socially, and that meant cutting herself free from everyone else. She began cooperating, not fully, but selectively, giving investigators just enough information to protect herself. And in doing so, she turned on men who had once controlled her world. The alliances that once protected her now threatened to destroy her, and she had to decide whether to save herself or remain loyal to a system already collapsing. Power protects itself until it can't, and when that protection cracks, people stop asking who is right and start asking who will survive. That moment had arrived in Natchez. Federal investigators began interviewing plantation owners, not politely, not socially, but with warrants and sworn statements. Men who had never been questioned before were suddenly being asked about labor deaths, false records, and profit-sharing agreements. And for the first time, they were afraid. Whispers of arrests spread through town. Banks began freezing accounts. Business partners stopped returning calls. And loyalty, once built on shared profit, collapsed into self-preservation. Margaret watched this unfold with precision. She provided documents when asked. She answered questions carefully, never lying, but never offering more than necessary, because she understood something dangerous. Truth does not save you. Strategy does. Meanwhile, Sarah prepared to testify, not about finances, but about daily reality. The fields, the illnesses, the punishments, the silence after accidents. Her words could not be dismissed as accounting errors. They were human experiences, and human stories are harder to bury. But testifying meant revealing herself publicly, not as an heir, but as a witness, and witnesses become targets. The night before her testimony, Whitfield told her the truth. Protection could not be guaranteed. Federal law was still weak, local hostility was still strong, and once she spoke, there would be no safe place in town. Sarah slept anyway, because exhaustion had replaced fear. The next day she stood in court, hands shaking, voice steady, and she spoke, not emotionally, not angrily, but clearly. She described quotas. She described how workers were punished for slowing down. She described how her mother was forced to keep working while sick, and how no doctor was called until it was too late. The courtroom did not interrupt, because no one could argue with experience. Then something unexpected happened. One plantation owner stood, and he asked to speak. He admitted wrongdoing, not fully, but enough to implicate others. Because when prosecution becomes inevitable, cooperation becomes currency. That single statement shattered the alliance. Within days, more men began talking, each trying to be less guilty than the next, each offering information in exchange for protection. And what they revealed was a system built on exploitation far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Margaret was questioned again, this time harder. They asked what she knew, what she had seen, what she had suspected, and she answered carefully, admitting ignorance where she could, admitting distance where she couldn't deny proximity. She positioned herself as uninvolved, and in many ways, she was telling the truth, but the town did not forgive her, because while she might not have signed documents, she had benefited from the system, and people needed someone visible to blame. Social doors closed, invitations stopped. Her reputation collapsed faster than her fortune, and the woman once known as the Queen of the Plantation became a social outcast. Sarah, meanwhile, became something else entirely, a symbol, some. She represented justice, to others, betrayal, and that made her presence dangerous in both directions. Federal charges were prepared, not against everyone, but against enough people, to change the balance of power in the region, and that was unprecedented. But justice does not move quickly, and danger does not wait for verdicts. Whitfield warned Sarah that after testimony, retaliation often comes quietly, not in court, but in shadows, and she would need to leave town soon, because even if they won legally, social punishment could last a lifetime. Sarah asked one final question. What happens to the inheritance? Whitfield did not answer immediately, because now, the estate was tied to criminal investigation. Assets could be seized, property could be frozen, money could disappear into legal battles. The fortune might not survive the truth. Sarah realized something painful. This fight had never been about wealth. It had been about accountability. By the time the final hearings arrived, Natchez no longer felt like a proud river town. It felt like a place holding its breath. Shops closed early, church sermons turned into quiet warnings about judgment, and families who once dined together now avoided eye contact in the streets because everyone understood. This verdict would not just decide inheritance, it would decide whose past could remain hidden. The courtroom was filled before sunrise. Federal officials sat alongside local judges, reporters packed the back rows, and in the center of it all, two women sat facing very different futures. Margaret Thornton, once untouchable, now visibly exhausted, and Sarah, no longer invisible, but no longer safe. The prosecution spoke first. They did not focus on emotion. They focused on patterns, labor records, medical neglect, financial incentives. They showed that suffering had been profitable, and that profitability had been protected by silence and influence. Then came the defense, not just Margaret's attorneys, but lawyers representing multiple plantation families. They argued tradition. They argued economic necessity. They argued that judging the past by modern standards was unfair. And in that argument, they revealed exactly how disconnected they were from the pain they were defending. Margaret was called to speak, and for the first time, she did not perform. Her voice was tired. Her words were careful. She admitted she had known conditions were harsh. She admitted she had benefited from the system, but she denied knowing the full extent of the abuses, and whether that was true or not, it no longer mattered, because the system itself was now on trial. Then Sarah was asked to speak one final time, not as an heir, not as a witness, but as someone who had lived inside the consequences of every decision being debated. She did not speak long. She spoke simply. She said no amount of money could replace a mother. No inheritance could erase years of fear, and no courtroom decision could change what had already happened. But she said if the truth was buried again, then nothing would ever change. Silence followed, not respectful silence, heavy silence, the kind that forces people to confront themselves. The judges withdrew, and for hours, no one knew what would happen. When they returned, no one moved. The verdict was read slowly, deliberately. The court upheld the will. Sarah was legally confirmed as Hay. Margaret would receive limited financial protection, but not control of the estate. Then came the second ruling. Criminal investigations would continue. Several plantation owners would face prosecution, and labor practices would be placed under federal oversight. The room erupted, not in celebration, but in disbelief. Because this outcome satisfied no one completely. It punished powerful men, but it did not restore the dead. It validated Sarah's claim, but it did not promise her safety. It spared Margaret prison, but it destroyed her social standing. Outside, crowds reacted violently, some in anger, some in relief, some demanding more justice, others demanding silence. And for the first time, town authorities had to separate opposing sides. Sarah did not attend celebrations. She did not give interviews. She was moved immediately, because winning in court does not mean surviving outside it. Margaret returned to an empty house, rooms once filled with servants, now silent, portraits still hanging, but no visitors, no invitations, no influence, only consequences. The victory was real. Winning a court case does not end a war. Sometimes, it only changes the battlefield. And for Sarah, the war had just begun. She was moved out of Natchez within days, not publicly, not with ceremony, just quietly, under protection that could not be discussed, because now she carried something more dangerous than truth. She carried resentment. The estate remained frozen in legal review, assets tied to investigations, property contested, businesses suspended. What had once looked like unlimited wealth was now trapped in paperwork and politics, and Sarah, the legal owner, could not touch most of it. She lived in rented rooms, changed addresses, avoided familiar faces, and learned to recognize footsteps behind her. Not because anyone attacked her again, but because fear does not disappear with verdicts. It learns to wait. Margaret, meanwhile, experienced a different kind of punishment, not from courts, but from society. Her invitations stopped. Her allies avoided association. Church members moved seats away from her, not because they suddenly cared about justice, but because scandal is contagious. She sold furniture, she closed parts of the house, and learned what it felt like to be ignored, which for someone raised in influence felt worse than poverty. Federal investigations continued. Some men were charged, some settled quietly, some used lawyers to delay for years. Justice came, but slowly, and slowly does not heal pain. Sarah was asked to testify again in later proceedings. She refused, not because she lied before, but because reopening the past was destroying what little stability she had found. And investigators did not push, because even systems know when they have taken enough, but peace never truly arrived. Every unfamiliar face felt like a threat. Every unexpected letter felt dangerous. Every noise outside her door pulled her back into survival mode. Whitfield visited her once. Years later, he told her the estate would finally be released, that financially she would now be secure. She thanked him, but security is not the same as safety. She asked about Margaret. Whitfield hesitated, then told her the truth. Margaret had died quietly, not wealthy, not respected, just forgotten, and that ending in many ways felt like justice to no one. Sarah did not sell Ebrate because by then she understood something painful. This story did not produce winners, only survivors. She used part of the money to support workers' families, quietly, without publicity, because she did not want attention. She wanted repair, and yet, no matter how far she went, Natchez followed her in memory, in scars, in stories people would tell differently, depending on who was listening. Some called her brave, others called her cursed, but no one ever called her free, because freedom is not just legal status, it is the absence of fear, and fear had become part of her identity. Years passed, Natchez changed, the Mississippi still flowed, carrying whispers and rumors downstream, and yet the scars of the Thornton inheritance remained etched in the town's memory. Sarah Thornton's story became legend, not for wealth, not for scandal, but for survival. She never returned to Natchez publicly, never sought recognition, but her presence lingered in the courthouse, in old plantation houses, in conversations hushed behind closed doors. Historians would later study Robert Thornton's records and marvel at his foresight. He had known society would resist justice, He had chosen a seemingly powerless heir to carry the burden of truth, and in doing so, he ensured accountability would not be silenced entirely. Margaret's downfall became a cautionary tale, not of crime, not fully of greed, but of misplaced trust in systems built on fear. Power can be fleeting, reputation even more so, and influence can vanish faster than wealth. Natchez learned slowly that silence is fragile, and that the consequences of injustice do not disappear with death. They linger, they echo, they haunt. Sarah, far from the town that feared her, used her inheritance differently. She provided for survivors of exploitation. She funded education. She offered opportunity to those who would have been ignored for generations. And she did so quietly. No newspaper articles, no recognition, no trophies, because the real inheritance was not money. It was responsibility. And responsibility carries a weight few are willing to bear. The descendants of those involved still tell the story differently. Some claim scandal, some whisper of courage, and some still fear what happens when the past is examined too closely. The estate stands as a monument, not to luxury, not to power, but to choices and to the consequences that cannot be erased. And the final truth remains: a single act of conscience can ripple through generations. A voice once silenced can still shake the foundations of the powerful, and the town of Natchez, like the Mississippi itself, carries the story forward, flowing quietly through history, haunting all who try to forget. But so is the cost, and accountability is expensive. Much darker game,